This is Dan Schneider, and this is Another American Television with Mitchell Hadley. This time we will be talking about the precursor to television shows, TV shows that began on radio and crossed over during the big transition of the 1940s and 50s. I will admit right up, this is a very weak point in my television fandom. So basically, I'm going to be throwing some softballs for Mitch to hit out of the ballpark. But before we do that, anyone who hasn't seen us, Mitchell Hadley is a television expert, and we are trying out for the first time a new system here called Meet Hour because I was having issues with Zoom and Teams, and this promises to give multiple people free multiple hours. So anyway, Mitch, who are you? What do you do? And take us into the radio days of your.
Well, I am, as Dan mentioned, a classic TV historian. I have written two books on classic television. My most recent is it's called Darkness in Prime Time, and it is about the programs of the 50s and 60s that foresaw our modern society and its, as I put it, decline in health. That's available at Amazon and at my website, it'sabouttv.com, where I write constantly about classic television. And as Dan mentioned, I thought this would be a good time to take a look at the evolution of television, beginning with radio, because that's where a lot of the early shows came from. And I thought it was particularly appropriate now because we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the golden age of radio. Some of you might have seen a feature that they recently did on CBS Saturday Morning about that. It was 100 years ago that what we think of as the golden age of radio began. And by the late 40s, radio was well established as the dominant entertainment form in the home. As television came about, there were several concerns, one of them being that TV would eventually elbow out radio altogether. And that has essentially come to pass, but it was by no means guaranteed at the time of the initial transition. And the first television shows tend to come from radio. The radio programs already had established audiences. The stars and the writers were already proven commodities. And you already had these scripts, the formats, the characters. They were easily transferred from radio to television. The sponsors were there. Everything was in place. So it was natural that what would happen would be that you'd come up with TV versions of radio programs, especially successful ones. Now, there are two claims as to the first genre that moved over to television from radio. I think we'll be looking at both of those separately. But the two genres that first made the crossover, or the transition from radio to television, are soap operas during the day and the variety and quiz shows that came on in prime time. They were both naturals, as I say. The soap operas had built-in sponsorship, it had built-in followings, and they were in a very nice 15-minute format that translated well from radio to television. It allowed for one commercial break, it allowed for the sponsor to get solid advertising in, and because they were continuing stories that would be on 15 minutes a day, Monday through Friday, they were readily made programs for TV. Flip side of that, the variety shows, the quiz shows, those were also very popular on radio. You just have to think back to Jack Benny, Red Skelton, just as two very quick examples of stars who had established themselves on radio. So it was fairly obvious that they would be coming over to television. And their shows were naturals, again, to make the transition. You had, with both Benny and Skelton, you had established supporting casts, you had established storylines, characters. So they were obvious choices. Not all of the shows that we will be talking about were as obvious. Not all of the shows that succeeded on radio succeeded on TV. As a matter of fact, some of them were spectacularly unsuccessful. And we'll be able to trace this all the way from the late 40s to when television actually came into its own and began to develop its own TV concepts for programs. And as the golden age of radio ended, we see television maturing into its own programming entertainment guide. And that's kind of when we'll bring this to an end in the late 50s, when you really have stopped the transition from radio to TV. And in fact, radio is beginning to phase out its regular programming anyway.
So before we get into the scripted radio to TV shows, fictional stuff, I do want to ask about two areas, though, that were covered in radio that weren't fictionalized, and that is national news and sports. I know, for example, that in the 50s, we were just starting to get national anchormen, anchoring television shows, and we had things like the Game of the Week on NBC for baseball being described. What, if any, television shows? I mean, did, for example, the Today Show, something like that? Did they have that on radio and it carry over? And did they have a national Game of the Week, or say on Saturday, college football that carried over?
Yeah, as far as news programs were concerned, the networks did not have a Today Show type of program per se, but they did have news and information programs that ran on a weekly basis. They would have the updates that came on at the top or the bottom of the hour. They would also have programs that were personality based. You would have some of the radio news hosts with their own news analysis programs. A program like Meet the Press began on radio. And so radio from the very beginning was a very important part of news coverage. If you look at everything going backwards from the death of FDR to D-Day to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, to even the death of Warren Harding, you see national radio being the primary source of news for these kinds of things, even if all they were doing was reading off of the wire services. So news was always an important part of radio. And you can argue, I think successfully, that it wasn't until the assassination of President Kennedy that radio became a secondary source for news. Even when Kennedy is shot and the first bulletins are coming in, there's this tendency for people to talk about, turn on your radio. Now, part of this is because people are at their offices or in their cars. They're not at home. But after the assassination of Kennedy, after the extensive coverage the TV provided, it became more and more normal to have this transition again over to television, where people think about turning on the TV first as opposed to turning on the radio. It's a gradual process, but it does proceed apace. Sports is interesting because it's an easy thing to cover on radio. The first examples of doing baseball games, for example, on radio, are actually reenactments. And this is how Ronald Reagan, for example, got his start in radio, doing reenactments where they would have the ticker coming in the studio. And the announcer would read what was going on from the ticker. Some of them were more specific. They would actually give you a little bit of the detail on the number of pitches, was it a ball, was it a strike, things like that. Others would just be very simple summaries, and it was kind of up to the announcer to fill in the details. But they might have sound effects, they'd have crowd noises, they'd have the crack of the bat. It depended on how elaborate they wanted to be.
It reminds me, the Woody Allen film Radio Days, there's a segment where they're describing a guy who's a pitcher and he loses an arm, and then he pitches on the other, and then he loses a leg. And it goes on for like 2 or 3 minutes like that. That must be based upon what you just said about these reenactments.
Yeah, there was an example. I can't remember who the announcer is right now, but there was an example of a baseball game where all of a sudden they lost the ticker.
Mm.
Right in the middle of the game, it goes out, and he has to ad lib. He doesn't know what to do, so he starts having the batter foul off pitches, and he fouled off like 16 or 17 pitches in a row, just vamping for time
Mm.
until the ticker came back up. And as soon as it did, then the game was able to progress. But there was another famous example in a football game about being able to cover your mistakes, uh, where where the announcer was doing the play-by-play. By this time things have transitioned over, so you're actually covering live, and I'll loop back to that in just a second. It's just another example of what you could do with radio. The announcer is calling a long touchdown run, and to his horror, he discovers when the runner is only 15 yards out from scoring, he's misidentified the player. He's got the wrong guy going in for the touchdown. And so, just as he's about to go in for the score, the announcer says, "Oh, and he laterals off to Smith, and Smith takes it in for the touchdown." So, one of the advantages to radio like that was that you were able to, unlike doctors who bury their mistakes, in radio you were kind of able to fudge it. You were able to cover up to a certain amount. And for announcers who had a propensity for drink and weren't necessarily 100% sober when they were doing the games, this was a particular godsend. But as far as the impact of the game of the week and different things like that, the main concern that sports had then, as would later be the case in television, was whether or not it would affect the live game. If people would actually go to the game, if they could sit at home and watch and listen to it on the radio. And especially as you had radio announcers begin to develop their style. And radio became, for its time, such an intimate means of communication. The announcers began to have their own way of creating family with the people who would listen on the at home. And to a certain extent, it actually became preferable to listen to the game on the radio than to attend the game in person. That's the kind of thing that they worried about as the games progressed on the radio. So, for example, you would have situations where a team would broadcast its road games, but not its home games, so that it preserved the game. Same thing in football. College football, especially the bowl games, are huge on radio. And if you go on YouTube, you can hear a lot of these things, by the way. You have stations on YouTube, channels that are totally devoted to historic radio broadcasts of baseball and football. So you can listen to the World Series games of the 30s and 40s. You can hear Lou Gehrig at the plate. You can hear DiMaggio going back to make a catch in center field. You can hear Red Grange running for a touchdown. It's incredible from a history standpoint, but it also preserves a way of how these games were called, and it's just a very interesting sideline. But yes, to answer your question, sports was always and news were always big on radio.
Yeah, when you said Red Grange, I'm thinking the Galloping Ghost was his nickname. And it seems to me that I know my dad, who died in '83, was born in 1960, and one of his favorite radio memories was the second Joe Louis-Max Schmeling fight, where Louis got his revenge against Schmeling.
Yes.
And that was big on the radio. And it seemed to me that we've talked before about the early television days and prize fighting and pro wrestling, wrestlers like Gorgeous George being huge stars in the late '40s. It seems to me radio allowed for mythos because you had to use your mind to envision this. Whereas when you got to television, you could see the guy was a palooka. He wasn't necessarily some godlike figure. Was there any worry? Because Friday Night Fights was a big thing for the first decade or so with TV starting. Was there any worry about a come down to reality, that television was more realistic and might not interest the way radio did? Because not only did you have that, but you later had, for example, The Third Man, and you had the Harry Lime adventures. but it's still not the film. So was there any worry that seeing these people, these sports heroes, was somehow going to let people down?
I think that one of the biggest worries they had was really about the romance of the sport, and that touches a lot on what you're talking about. That when the mind's eye is responsible for giving you the vision of what it is that you're hearing. Um, there is no limit to it. And so, for the obvious advantages that you might have in seeing what's going on, I think there was a real concern that part of the romance, the drama, the spectacle of sport on radio would be lost in the translation. You would look at a fighter like Jack Dempsey, for example, who was built up so much on radio. And people, of course, did see these events in the theaters on newsreels, so it wasn't entirely foreign.
Yeah.
But again, you were seeing the highlights. You were seeing edited versions of these fights. So I think that there was something of a concern about that, but I think that it was probably overcome just by the idea that you could actually see what was going on, and that that became a big thing. When you look at radio to television in general, and you look at someone like Stan Freberg, who is so great at using radio. And he would talk about how you could have a brass band, you could have a symphony orchestra, you could have somebody trying to jump the Grand Canyon on radio. You couldn't do any of these things on TV. So I think that enters into everything that we're talking about. And when we talk about some of the shows that failed to make the transition from radio to TV, we're going to see that that's part of the problem. They weren't able to take the vision people had and make it work on TV the way it could in the mind.
Yeah, I was just thinking.
Interesting thing, just to put a footnote on that about radio and boxing. You would think that boxing disappeared from radio fairly quickly, but in fact, as the major championship fights moved from free television to pay-per-view, and at that point I'm talking about the theater
Yeah.
broadcasts, where you'd go to a movie theater, pay money, and you'd see the fight on the big screen. As they made that transition, radio actually had a little bit of a renaissance in covering some of these fights. They wouldn't be doing a blow by blow, but they would be reconstructing it much in the same way that the early baseball games did. They didn't try to kid you that you were hearing the fight as it happened, but they would read, for example, the Associated Press blow-by-blow account of the fight as soon as the round was over. They'd say, here are the results of the sixth round. I remember hearing the Fraser Ali fight in 1971 that way on the radio, because it was only done in the theaters and you were going to wait a long time before it came on. So it was done on the radio, and that was how you were able to keep track of what's going on.
Yeah, I was thinking as he was speaking, saying some of these things, that someone like Muhammad Ali, though, had to be on TV.
Yes.
He would not have worked on radio, because you
Couldn't.
wouldn't have got the antics in the ring or out of the ring. You wouldn't have seen the way he mocked his opponents with the faces, putting his chin in like, hit me, hit me, hit me.
Agreed. And when you try to listen to a fight on the radio, depending on how it's mic'd, oftentimes the quickness of the sport, when you've got a flurry in the corner and the sound of the crowd, will make it very difficult for you to be able to hear what's going on. So it again is an obvious advantage to be able to see it.
So let's go now to scripted television, as that's the meat of what we're going to be talking about. When I think of radio shows that go to TV, the big two that come to my mind are You Bet Your Life, Groucho Marx, who, that radio show basically resurrected his career after the demise of his comedy team with his brothers. And then, of course, Lucille Ball, My Favorite Husband, was it called? Which later
Yes, it
came
was.
out.
Yes.
So
Well,
you want to take that as the starting point?
Yeah. You Bet Your Life, as you say, started on radio in 1947, and it debuted on TV in 1950. And it was a very easy program to make the transition, because all they really did was put the camera on, and they showed pretty much exactly the show. It didn't change except that you could see what was going on. But it what the advantage was, the reason that You Bet Your Life worked so well on television, so much better than it did on radio, is because you could see Groucho. And it was his facial reactions,
Yeah.
particularly, that drove the show. That he was a master of being able to, whether he'd cock an eyebrow or just look askance at someone or have kind of a smirk, those became a highlight of the show. And that doesn't come through on radio. So I think you could argue that even though it's a very simple adjustment, it doesn't, unlike some of the shows that we'll be talking about, it didn't require a format change at all. It just accentuated what was already there. But there must have been this idea in the minds of the people who were putting shows on, that they suddenly realized just how they could exploit the idea of TV as a visual medium. More than just putting pictures to words, you could now do things that you weren't able to do when you were just simulcasting a show. It could take on a life of its own.
Was not You Bet Your Life live on radio, but then it was cut down to a half-hour format on TV? Am I wrong?
I don't think you are wrong. I could be wrong in agreeing with you on that, but that's my recollection of it as well. So
And how about Lucille Ball?
okay, so I think it's 1948, Lucy starts a show called My Favorite Husband. And it's a pretty standard domestic comedy. It's a married couple. They're navigating these humorous situations. It is very typical of a Lucy show in the sense that you're talking about misunderstandings. You're talking about the typical domestic mishaps. You've got the banter going on between Lucy and her husband. Now, her husband in My Favorite Husband is not Desi Arnaz. It's Richard Denning. And people might remember Richard Denning from various things. He was in a lot of B science fiction movies, some of which you can see on Mystery Science Theater. He was famously the governor in the original Hawaii Five-0. He was Michael Shane, the private investigator, in a series that ran for one season in the early 60s. And he did other TV series and guest appearances. But he became quite well known on My Favorite Husband. And when the show made its transition from radio to TV, it had a very loyal audience. They had a great chemistry. It was a natural draw to make the transition. However, Lucy had also gained a certain amount of clout on this, and she wanted her own husband, Desi, to be on the show with her, and not Denning. Nothing, as far as I know, it's nothing personal about Denning, but she saw this as an opportunity to present a vehicle for Desi. And so she insisted that she would not make the transition without having Desi on there. Now, what does this do as My Favorite Husband becomes I Love Lucy? Well, one of the most obvious things is we start to see the emphasis on physical comedy. And for people who associate Lucy with that, it's kind of hard to imagine that the idea that her show is successful on the radio, because it's so difficult to portray that kind of thing. But the show transitions from being just this run-of-the-mill, albeit very popular domestic comedy, to having all of these physical aspects. You had the slapstick comedy, you had the visual gags, everything, the eggs stomping the grapes, the long nose that catches on fire. You have her out on the ledge with Superman rescuing her. All things that would have been almost impossible to do on radio. And if you did try to do them, they wouldn't be funny. So this is another example of a very dramatic change from radio to TV. It becomes even more iconic. It also becomes a very important part of television history, as we've discussed, the 3-camera setup, the pre-recording, the show being done in Hollywood rather than New York. But as far as the radio version of it is concerned, it becomes so successful that in fact most people don't even know that it started on radio unless you're an old time radio fan or unless you've done your homework about Lucy. You think that show was created for TV. That's how perfectly the format works on television. But no, in fact, it does have its roots as a very successful radio program.
So where do you want to go from there? You want to talk about some more sitcoms?
Yeah, I think that there are some that are worth talking about because because they are very successful. Another sitcom that people may not be aware of that had its start on radio is Father Knows Best.
Hmm.
That started on radio in 1949. It didn't come over to TV until 1954. One of the advantages that it had on television was that in coming over to television, it retained the same starring cast. You had Robert Young and Jane Wyatt as the father and mother, and so that was central to it. But it changed as well. You were able to present a suburban setting that really you couldn't portray on radio. Again, part of the magic of radio is that you're able to create any setting that you want. Part of the disadvantage of radio is that if you're simply talking about the difference between a home in the city and a home in the suburbs, you don't really understand that. Another difference is that Jim Anderson, the Robert Young character, is a little sterner on the radio than he is on television. One of the things that Robert Young is very concerned about was that he did not want Jim Anderson to become a caricature. He knew that television had the propensity of doing that. As a matter of fact, that most of the TV dads were kind of like Chester Riley, William Bendix's character in The Life of Riley. They were boobs of various quantities and always getting bailed out. He did not want that. He did not want a sitcom where the father was the butt of the jokes. He did not want a sitcom where the kids had all the smart aleck lines. He insisted on some fidelity to the line that father knows best. And so it makes a very successful transition to TV, runs until 1960, actually is one of the few series that runs for an entire season just compiled of reruns. Well, after they just stopped making original episodes, they kept it on for another year just because with the reruns. So it didn't make a lot of changes, but it did go with the suburban setting, and it was able to expand the visual comedy more.
I just have to ask about Life of Riley because I was looking
Mhm.
up and initially I didn't see it in the Wikipedia list of radio to TV programs. And I was thinking, I could have sworn Life of Riley started on radio. But so it was successful on radio, then it transfers to TV. But with Jackie Gleason for a year,
Correct.
it
Hmm.
bombs. A couple of years later, they bring Bill Bendix. Was Bendix the radio?
Yes, he was.
So why
Yes,
did
he
they go
was.
with Bendix? Why did they go with Jackie Gleason? Was it because he was younger and cheaper at that
Well,
time?
as I recall, and I could be mistaken about this, but as I recall, Bendix had movie obligations that were going to prevent him at the time from going to TV. There may be some other things as well, but it was at least discussed that Bendix would be the TV version as well. When they moved Riley over to TV with Gleason as Riley, you're right. His manic kind of bug-eyed Chester Riley just didn't work. It wasn't the same as the everyman persona that Bendix brought. And Bendix was not a manic, he was a long suffering husband and father. When the show went to TV in that Gleason version, there was only one member of the cast that came over from radio. It was Digger O'Dell, the Undertaker, and his famous exit line whenever he left a scene, he would say, "I'll be shoveling off," and I think he also had the line about how I'll be seeing you eventually, that type of thing. But he was
Prisoner,
the only
prisoner,
one.
prisoner alert.
Yeah, yes, he was
Who
the
knows?
only
Maybe
one
an
who made it.
Undertaker was the one who founded the village.
Yes, yes. That could be. I have to think of that. I have a friend who's doing a series on the prisoner as an allegory of the Soviet Union. I'll have to ask him if he ever thought of the life of Riley. But the second version, the Bendix version, is much more successful. It goes from 53 to 58. It's got the sponsorship. The humor is physical enough that it works on TV just as well as it did on radio. So that becomes a much more successful version. Amos and Andy, I think, is a good one to bring up because Amos and Andy was an example of how you were able to get away with things. Of course, it's fairly well known that the creators of Amos and Andy, the men who played the characters on the radio, were white. And people didn't know that unless they read about it or heard about it, because they were very good at being able to affect that sound. But when it came over to TV, well, obviously you were going to have to make some changes. You had to have an entirely new cast. However, you did have some real advantages. You had a whole batch of scripts that you could go from, because Amos and Andy had been on radio from 1928 to 1960. Incredibly long run. A lot of these shows that are on radio have these long runs that almost impossible to think of as far as TV. And of course, part of that is because you were able to replace the lead actors as long as they still sounded good. You didn't have to explain things away. But Amos and Andy had it was very popular. It had an audience. It had sponsorship. It had the script. So it made an easy transition over to TV. And even after it goes off the air, it had a surprisingly short run, only a couple of years. But even after it goes off the air on network, it still continues to be in syndication. You can see TV guides from the early 1960s where Amos and Andy is still on. And some of them are in the graveyard time. I think that, if I'm not mistaken, Channel 4 in the Twin Cities ran it at 12:35 or something during the week, at night, overnight. But there were other stations that would run it in the afternoon or even in the daytime. So the stigma that it currently has was slow to arise to the point that it would take it off TV altogether. But that I think is an interesting example in itself of a comedy that makes a successful transition.
You know, I was just looking at some of the comedies, and I remember in the mid '70s when I was about 10 or 11 on during the summertime from like 11 till 1:30 when the TVs went off air. They would have all these old shows, and I would see the Jack Benny show. I would see the Abbott and Costello show. I'd see Milton Berle. I'd see Jack. Did I say Jack Benny? And Burns and Allen. And
Yes.
I was shocked to see. Was Burns? I could have sworn Burns and Allen was on radio, but it doesn't. They're not listed on Wikipedia.
It was. It actually it started on radio in 1932.
Oh, okay.
And it ran from 32 to 50, and then it went directly over to TV and ran from 50 to 58. But it was, it was again something that transitioned easy because both George and Gracie had these firmly established characters that they had played on radio, and her comic logic, as it were, that translated without any trouble. It worked with sight gags just as well as it did in dialogue, and the idea of the show within a show worked as well. So that was a program that transitioned
and
easily.
I wanted to ask about that because I know Jack Benny did it, Burns and Allen did it, Abbott and Costello did it. They would come out at the beginning of the show, usually with just plain curtains behind them, and then say, "Last Tuesday I went to the laundromat, and this is what happened," and they'd do a little shtick, and then we'd see the thing. They'd come back at the end and say, "Boy, Gracie," or "Boy, Lou, we really got out of that fix, didn't we?" All of this fourth wall breaking, was that a carryover from radio?
Yeah, because in the Benny show particularly, you would usually have that kind of thing, and oftentimes they would stage it a little differently. On Benny's radio program, oftentimes what you are hearing is supposedly the rehearsal for the show. So there's, Jack is saying, okay, we'll get everybody together and we'll run through this bit that we're going to have on the show. And so the bit became the rehearsal for what would supposedly be on the show. But because it had a live audience, Benny was very good at breaking the wall. Sometimes he had to, because they were having difficulty keeping a straight face, or somebody would muff a line, and he would address that fairly frankly. But he also had this regular cast of characters that helped, because he had Don Wilson, Dennis Day, Bob Crosby as a band leader, and before that Phil Harris, and of course Mary Livingston.
And Eddie
And
Rochester.
Mm-hmm. And there were things like the Maxwell that Mel Blanc would do the voice, as it were, of the car. The Maxwell, I think, always worked better on radio than it did on TV. And the Benny vault. When you talk about Benny and his money, and you listen to some of the episodes of Benny where he's going down into the vault to make a withdrawal, and you hear him going down steps and through doors and down more steps, and you've got guards, and you've got combination locks and all of these things, and it presents this magnificent picture of how safe he's keeping his money. That never translates well into TV. What he has, though, as an advantage is all of these other things, everything from his type of thing. He could do it vocally and did so on the radio. You could visualize it, but on TV it really comes across. And so there were ways to make up some of the deficits that you lost on the transition by introducing other visual gags that worked well. I think that the breaking the fourth wall, I've heard a lot of the Benny shows on the radio, and if you discount the ones where he's entertaining the troops, where it's almost mandatory that you break the fourth wall because you're interacting with the audience, if you discount those, what you see on TV is pretty much the same as what you get on the radio.
I'll bet you Rob Reiner got from his father that whole thing about walking down and under and getting lost there for Spinal Tap. Remember that scene in Cleveland where I think Cleveland, where they get lost, they can't find the stage.
Well, that brings up an interesting point. Rather than just sticking on a strict thing, I've got my whole outline of notes on here are the sitcoms, here's this, here's that. But this is a good time to bring up an example of a radio to television transfer that failed, and why it failed, for the same reason. It is Fibber McGee and Molly. That was a very popular show on radio. It did not work on TV. Why didn't it work? Well, one of the obvious reasons it didn't work was because you didn't have the original cast. You had the husband and wife team that did Fibber McGee on radio, the Jordans, didn't want to do the TV series. They were tired of performing. They didn't really want to perform in front of a camera, so you had a whole new cast. But the biggest problem, I think, is that you had Fibber McGee's famous closet, which surprisingly enough isn't as big a part of the radio show as you might think. When you listen to Fibber McGee and Molly, so much of the humor is based on verbal humor. You don't, that closet where he's got everything in there. And the great joke, of course, is that he goes to open the closet door and everything comes out, and you can hear just about everything in the studio that is not nailed down crashing around to create the effect of it. That's a marvelous thing to hear on the radio. No matter what you do, you cannot possibly replicate what people thought that looked like on television. So that didn't work. And as the closet becomes more important to the story, it fails even more. the other sound gags, the structure of the show. You know, we talk about how some of these basic sitcoms are able to translate over very easily. The structure of Fibber McGee and Molly was different because they always had people dropping in. And that's easy enough to do on the radio because you have them knocking at the door, you have them coming over, all these different things. It doesn't work as quite as easily on TV because it becomes so stage bound, and because you have to keep creating reasons why people continue to come over to the McGee house to engage in conversation. So there was no chemistry with the cast, but there was also no chemistry with the basic premise of the show. So when that made an attempt to go to TV, it failed miserably. And there are many examples of shows that you would think would have succeeded that didn't for that same reason. There's another one of the great shows of old time radio, yours truly, Johnny Dollar, which is one of my favorite old time radio shows. Um, that they never even got to TV. I think they made a pilot, and that was about it. But Johnny Dollar didn't work, whereas some of the detective series do, for a couple reasons. One, Bob Bailey. Bob Bailey was the star of yours truly, Johnny Dollar. Many actors played Johnny Dollar, and this goes back to something I was saying before. Johnny Dollar was able to succeed for a long run on radio, partly because they were able to change the leads so often. You even had Edmund O'Brien before he became such a major movie star playing him on radio. But Bob Bailey is the one that most people think of. He just didn't have the look. He didn't look anything like you would think that Johnny Dollar would look like. And at the same time, it was difficult to imagine hearing anybody besides Bob Bailey playing him. Also, Johnny Dollar was unique in that most of the show is narrated, it's voiceover, it's internal, it's not visual. And so, in translating Johnny Dollar to TV, you really wouldn't have been able to capture the character of Dollar. You wouldn't have been able to have him talking directly to the audience the way you felt that he was on radio. Unlike Dragnet, where the voiceover works very well because you still have Joe Friday talking with his partners and talking with the suspects and talking with the other characters. Johnny Dollar didn't have as much of that, and I think that's a reason why they didn't even really make a serious effort at trying to move it over.
In just looking over some shows on the Wikipedia list, I remember seeing again late night in the 1970s when they were just throwing whatever old programs they had up on the screen for the last hour or two. Seeing the old show You Are There, and that apparently started on radio. Number one, was it successful? And if so, because from what I've just scanned, it didn't seem to be as success. It was more successful on radio, and I'm wondering if that's because when you're going back or trying to visualize something, you can visualize George Washington trying to chop down the cherry tree. But if you put an actor doing it, you're like, well, that doesn't look like the George in my mind. And we talked about Steve Allen's show, the history show. What was it, though? It just slipped my mind.
Meeting of Minds.
Meeting of Minds. Was You Are There? Because it had the famous, as after he crossed the Delaware River, Washington came out there. Everything is as it was, except you are there.
Yes, that I think you've pretty much hit it there. Even despite the fact of having Cronkite as host on the TV version, there's just a difficulty in trying to reproduce some of these things, and there it becomes a stage bound in the sense that you can tell obviously that they're not on the Delaware River. They're in a studio somewhere in that example. And I think that there is always a difficulty when you're trying to replicate historical events on a very limited budget. There's also something that I think with You Are There, and this is a personal opinion only, having heard both the radio version and seen the TV version, there's something that I like to call the plausibility scale. And that means that whatever you're seeing or listening has to become plausible enough that you're willing to accept it. That if you need to suspend your disbelief, you can do it. There is something inherent in the idea of a television newsman interviewing George Washington that pushes the plausibility scale in a certain direction, in my way of thinking. Radio, in that sense, is less intrusive because you only hear the newsman, you don't see it, and it becomes a little easier to imagine that he's simply narrating what's going on. But if you try to put George Washington on TV, or Emperor Nero, or any of the characters that they would talk about on You Are There, it, to my way of thinking at least, it really pushes the plausibility meter.
Mitch, take it from here.
Well, I mentioned Dragnet earlier as an example of a show that made a very successful transition to television, despite the fact that it was heavily dependent on voiceover. Um, that's partly because it has a documentary style of storytelling where Jack Webb is doing all of the voiceovers, and it works well on radio, but it also made a very successful transition over to TV. And if you look at how the Dragnet TV series differs from the radio series, there's not a whole lot to it. You simply see what's going on. And sometimes when you look at the episodes that they reuse from radio to TV, Jack Webb talks about this in a TV Guide interview shortly after the TV series had debuted. And he talks because at this point Dragnet is on both radio and TV, and it's not the same episode either. At the end of the Dragnet radio episode that week, the announcer will be saying, "Stay tuned for a completely new episode on NBC TV Thursday night." Well, at that point, Webb points out they're into a cycle where they used the early scripts from Dragnet on TV when the TV series debuted. And the scripts that they were newly writing for the continuing radio version, they planned to recycle for TV in 6 or 8 months. They had a regular pattern on it. So Dragnet came to TV with a ready-made back pile of scripts, and then as the radio series continued, they would loop the new scripts in on kind of a backdated basis. So they were able to use every script twice, once for radio, once for TV. They would make minimal adjustments to it to insert commercials because the early Dragnet did not have any commercials. It was network supported. And because it sometimes takes longer to show something than it does to simply play it on the radio, they would have to make some changes to the script in order to accommodate that. But you had the ready-made version. The Joe Friday character translates very well from radio to TV, and his partners do the same, especially as you have the Frank Smith character who comes in on radio, but is pretty much there from the beginning on TV, and that they have a good chemistry, a good partnership. If you were to take the '60s version of Dragnet, the one that has Harry Morgan on it, you could put that on the radio with very little difficulty. So Dragnet was a natural.
Dragnet 67, I think it was. It was called.
Yes, yes. Gunsmoke is a fascinating example.
And was it Jim Arness and the same actress who played Miss Kitty?
Well, nobody came over from the radio to the TV version. Is that what you mean?
Oh, was that William Conrad doing?
Yes, Conrad did it on radio. Gunsmoke comes along very early, very late in the classic era of radio. Gunsmoke debuts on radio in 1952. And if you notice, most of the shows that we've talked about so far had their roots in the 30s and 40s. Gunsmoke doesn't come until 52. And it's a very, very detailed radio drama. It is a serious radio drama as opposed to, say, The Lone Ranger or Hopalong Cassidy or Gene Autry, the kinds of kid shows. Just as Wyatt Earp was the first adult Western on TV, and that's primarily because it got on the air just a few days before the TV version of Gunsmoke. Gunsmoke was not really a Western series on the radio. It was a drama series that coincidentally took place in the West. But they took an incredible care for detail, not just the sound of the horse's hooves, but when they would go into the Long Branch, they layered the sound effects of the conversation 3 or 4 times back from what they might need to. If you were walking down down Main Street in Dodge City, you could hear things going on in the houses. You could hear things going on in the blacksmith shop. You could hear the birds. You could hear the horses. They layered the sound effects to an incredible extent. So Gunsmoke was a fabulous version on radio. When it goes over to TV, they have some instant challenges, the first of which being that William Conrad does not look like Matt Dillon. And they did allow all of the actors who were on the radio to audition for the TV version, but it's thought that that was really more of a favor or a lip service type of thing than anything else, because they weren't going to be on the TV version. What they did do was brilliant casting for TV, plus the attention to detail, plus the scripts. They were using scripts from the radio, of course, for a long time, but the radio version will end, and Gunsmoke on TV goes on for 20 seasons. So that's an example of a show that takes on a life of its own after it leaves radio. It does have the crossover period, but as it matures into strictly a drama for TV, of course, it changes from a half an hour to an hour. It becomes almost more of an ensemble show and almost an anthology at times because of how it will focus episodes on particular guest stars. It starts to deal with very topical issues that are thinly disguised in a Western setting. But Gunsmoke, the radio series, was always very serious, and it is, in fact, I think you could argue Matt Dillon is a grimmer character on radio than he is on TV. Kitty's obviously a prostitute on the radio series. There's no question about that. She's at the very least a madam. It's obvious that Kitty and Matt have a special relationship. There were things that they didn't try to replicate on TV that are in the radio series if you look for it. But it does make an extremely successful transition to TV.
Yeah, and I think Gunsmoke, when you said it happens to be set in the West, it's one of those things that breaks the genre. I think in fact John Wayne was offered Matt Dillon on TV, and he's the guy who recommended Arness. I've heard that or seen that in
there are various accounts as to just how true it is that Wayne would have even considered it, or that they would have offered it to him. But it is true that he knew Arness, and it is true that he did the introduction to the very first episode of Gunsmoke.
And that sets up the character. And I don't want to stick too long on it, but it sets up the character of Matt Dillon, because I think he's up in a graveyard on a hill above Dodge City, and he's talking from the very first monologue that the man has in his 20-year run. He's talking about regrets. So it isn't the old shoot 'em up. It isn't the 1930s 40s serials. It's not the John Wayne, vengeance. The white man is coming for the red man's territory thing. But I wanted to ask, because I was looking through the list there and seeing a number of surprises. Our Miss Brooks, I hadn't realized that. That's Eve Arden did that, both radio and TV.
Yep. Eve Arden did Our Miss Brooks. That started in 1948 and it came on to TV in 52. They actually did a big screen movie version of Our Miss Brooks before it came on to TV. The whole premise of it was pretty easy to transfer over to TV. It allowed for the sight gags that you needed. Eve Arden was great on TV. The sarcasm that you hear on and her kind of sardonic outlook on life in general makes a really good transition. It's interesting that. The science teacher, Mr. Boynton, her unrequited love on radio. Jeff Chandler played him on the radio at the same time that Jeff Chandler was getting an Academy Award nomination in the movies. So Chandler at that point is one of the big names who's on radio. And, we could do a whole bit when talking about old time radio. You had Jimmy Stewart, you had Orson Welles, you had all kinds of stars who did radio programs. But Chandler, I just bring up because he did not make the transition to TV. But Our Miss Brooks does become successful as a TV series as well.
I was surprised to see that Lassie started on radio. The Lone Ranger I knew, but
Mhm.
but Lassie, was June Lockhart in the original?
No, no, she wasn't in the original even on. I don't know that she was in the original when it made the first transition to TV, although she was in the best known version of Lassie. But I don't remember if she was the original mother on the original Lassie. But um, yeah, you would think that Lassie on the radio would be kind of a difficult sell, but it does work. It starts in 1947, and in fact, the narrator is Rod Weatherwax, who is Lassie's uh, trainer, master, what have you, and so it does work. It's mostly a narrated type of thing. They do have Lassie, the dog, on the radio show. It's Pal, the dog who plays him in the early movies, and they've trained him how to whine or bark or pant on cue. So it's an interesting.
So Lassie started in the movies, went to radio, and then TV.
Yep.
Okay, because
Hmm.
I always knew there was a connection to Rin Tin Tin. I thought the TV version was the TV equivalent of Rin Tin Tin, but Lassie started on in film as well. Hmm.
Yeah, because I think Roddy McDowell is on one of the Lassie Come Home.
Yes, yes,
So,
yes, yes.
but
Now that makes sense.
but the radio version does run for 3 seasons. It goes from 1947 to 1950. So
So I was interested too to see not only the Lone Ranger but the Green Hornet, and I think the Green Hornet, I believe, is like a descendant of the Lone Ranger character
yes,
somehow.
yes, I forget exactly what their relationship is, but if you watch. If you watch the Lone Ranger, the origin story of the Lone Ranger, they do mention some of the family names and I can't remember if the Green Hornet is a nephew, cousin,
Yeah,
something
something
like
like
that.
that.
But there is a relationship, and one of the things that's interesting about the Green Hornet is that the Green Hornet's on the radio during World War II,
Mm.
and so you've got this difficult problem with Cato, the Green Hornet's manservant, who is clearly Oriental and might be Japanese, and horror that you would have a sympathetic Japanese character on the radio during World War II. So when you listen to the Green Hornet on the radio, they always make a point in every episode as they are introducing the Green Hornet and his Filipino manservant Kato. So they always, you don't have to worry, folks. He's not Japanese. He's a Filipino. So,
Which at the time was part of the U.S.
yes,
That's a
yes, and
territory.
it was, of course, a victim of what Japan was doing.
Yeah.
Japan had overrun the Philippines. MacArthur had promised to return. So the Philippines works out on a number of levels as being effective
So
for Cato.
the Green Hornet and the Lone Ranger are de facto early prototypes for, say, the superhero, which brings to mind, I was looking at, and there was no Zorro radio show. There was Zorro, but there was no TV. No, there was no Zorro radio show from what it says here. The Shadow was on radio, but they didn't try to make a TV show.
The Shadow didn't work on TV. They did a pilot, but it never became a series. And part of it is because that disembodied voice that you get on the Shadow, even Lamont Cranston, but still the invisible crime fighter gimmick just didn't work on TV the way it does on the radio, and so the pilot never was going to work, I don't think.
And I'm surprised that Superman. We know he had George Reeves in the 50s, and there were the serials in the 40s. I'm surprised that there wasn't a radio Superman.
No, there is. There's a
okay. Okay, go ahead.
Superman begins on radio in 1940.
Okay.
And Bud Collyer.
Don't trust Wikipedia.
No, I know that. Wikipedia will not work on this. But Bud Collyer is the voice of Superman on the radio.
Yeah, and he later became a newsman or
a game show host. He was the host of To Tell the Truth.
We talked about that before. You mentioned it.
Yep. Yeah. And what's interesting about that is when they make the Superman cartoons, because you've got Superman in multiple versions. You have the Superman radio series, which runs for 11 seasons on Mutual from 40 to 51. Then you've got the Superman TV series. Then you've got Superman animated adventures for the movies. And then you have Superman cartoons for Saturday morning. And even near the end of his life, the end of his career, Bud Collyer is still playing Superman in the animated versions. And I think that's a great thing. But yeah, it's I think there are a lot of people who probably, if you quizzed them on it, would remember that Bud Collyer was the voice of Superman on the radio. But I think most people, when they think of Superman, they think of the TV series. And then, of course, later generations think of Superman and they think of Christopher Reeve and the movie version. But Superman is one of those, again, that makes a pretty successful transition. They did a good job at showing Superman flying. And in this era, when superhero shows aren't as common on the radio, it's a very early example of a successful one. It works with the sound effects, the cliffhangers, because it's a serial, and so it carries over from episode to episode and works well. It works well in all the media.
So before we go to some other things, let's talk about what in your mind is the formula for a successful transition, and what is not, and are there any exceptions either way?
Well, I think that the key to success in going from radio to TV, on the business side, what obviously helps is that you've got a sponsor. If you've got a sponsor on radio that is willing to make the transition over to TV with you, you've already got an advantage to getting on TV. That's very mundane, but it does have to be mentioned. What makes a successful radio to TV transition? I think, first of all, it depends on the characters that you have. Again, you look at Jack Benny. All of those characters are very well established. Bendix as Riley is well established. Red Skelton is well established. So you have characters that people already know. You don't have to spend any time creating them. People will come into it already familiar with it. You have to have, unlike what I mentioned with Fibber McGee, you have to have a show that can exist outside of the theater of the mind. If you have a science fiction series, and you'll notice that although science fiction works pretty well on radio, not very many of them make the transition over to TV. They're not successful, and it's because it's so heavily dependent on you being able to imagine what you're seeing. When the effects come across, they have to be believable. And so in doing a show on TV, you have to be able to give people what they are expecting based on what they heard on the radio.
Yeah,
And I
this
think
show like The Outer Limits, which we've talked about many times, probably would not have worked on radio.
it may or may not. It could have been a show like Dimension X or some of the more successful series. But there again, you're talking about with Outer Limits something that really depended on the visual nature, the bug-eyed monster, and that doesn't work.
Hmm.
However, when you're talking about, um, and I'll say again, Dimension X, that's the one that's sticking in my mind right now. You can have these characters look like whatever you want. And so some of the science fiction series that are on radio during the golden age are pretty successful, but it is the inability to replicate those types of expectations that the audience might have that causes them to not be successful on TV. So you've got to be able to give the audience what they're looking for. And I think the premise has to switch over well. Is sitcoms do well because you've got a domestic formula that everybody understands. Crime shows, detective shows work well because you've got the prerequisites. You have the mystery that needs to be solved. Well, that works out pretty well. You have the charismatic detective, and if you can figure out how to work around the voiceovers, Richard Diamond is an example of one that worked very well going from radio to TV because they still retained some of the voiceovers, but David Janssen was a fine enough actor that he was able to carry the different type of Diamond. You have to have that, and you have to have an audience. Frankly, if the show's not a success on radio, it's going to be difficult to build up a success on TV. You've got a very obscure show on the radio. There was a summer replacement, actually. Yes, they had them on radio as well as TV. You had summer replacement series because the stars would take the summer off, and most of these shows were either live or they were at least topical. But there was a summer replacement series called Our Man Higgins, and it was a story about a very British manservant butler who comes to the United States and works for a family as their valet. And it wasn't very good. I've heard it on the radio. It's not funny. Some people might think it's hilarious. I didn't. Personal opinion.
Which brings to mind, was there a system like the Nielsen's for radio?
Yeah, there was. I forget what it was called, but there was something similar, and I think that it was that the accuracy of it was as questionable as the early Nielsen's, but they did have a way of measuring the audiences on the radio. And Higgins wasn't successful on radio. It makes a transition to TV. Several years later, somebody resuscitates the Higgins format and decides to do a TV show out of it with Stanley Holloway as the star. Guess what? It's not funny on TV either. So if your show isn't successful on the radio, where you have a whole lot of leeway to be able to make a success, hint, it's not going to be successful on TV either. So I guess to answer your question, in talking about what makes for a successful transition from radio to TV, you are inherently also talking about what makes a less successful transition. And when you talk about shows like Suspense, now Suspense ran for a long time on the radio. It was, in fact, along with yours truly, Johnny Dollar, Suspense was the last radio drama to leave the air in the early 1960s. There is a TV version of Suspense, but there's no real comparison between the two other than the title. The Suspense version on TV is a pretty good show. Not great, pretty good. But it's just a generic mystery show. You have shows like The Whistler. You have shows The Shadow, as we talked about, that are very successful on the radio, but they don't make the transition to TV. You have a show called Lum and Abner, that was on radio from 1931 to 54. It's very funny, I think. Not everybody will agree. This is an example of one of those shows that I did like that a lot of people don't. It's very dry and it's very rural in its humor, and those are two things that aren't going to work well on TV. The rural setting, unlike later shows where they figure out how to capitalize on it, a show like Green Acres, for example, it was difficult to get that rural humor from the farms and the country and condense it down into something you could show on TV. And the other problem is that the two characters, Lum and Abner, were so specific to what you were used to hearing on radio. And the humor, as I say, was very dry. And it wouldn't work with a laugh track. If you tried it, it wouldn't work. And they did have some versions of it on radio, I think, that had a laugh track. But they made a pilot for it, and if you were going to be a comedy on radio, you were going to have a laugh track, and it just was not a show that was made for something like that. There are other examples of that. I think I can just throw out some names. In Vic and Sadie, you had a show called Big Sister. You had some of the soap operas that came over that just didn't work out very well, and it was because they either didn't have a clearly defined format, or because they didn't have characters that carried over well from radio to TV, or some other aspects of it. You have a very unique situation of a radio show that makes two transitions to TV. Actually, if you can understand it, it is The Edge of Night. The Edge of Night starts out on radio as a crime-oriented soap opera, and it has a character who is the district attorney, who he's a lawyer. He's not a district attorney at this point. He's a lawyer, and they want to bring him onto TV in his own show. They want to call it Perry Mason, and Earl Stanley Gardner, who hated the movie versions of Perry Mason that had been made up to that point, said, "You're not going to take my character and put him in a primetime soap opera. I won't allow it." So he refused to allow the Mason type of character to come over. So they changed the character on The Edge of Night to Mike Kerr, the district attorney, and he became the lead character on the show. It comes over as The Edge of Night and has an incredibly long run on TV. But that's an odd example of a show that ran into problems in coming over because, in this case, Gardner wouldn't allow the character to make the transition.
So that's a nice segue back to the start of what we were talking about. The three types of shows that were generally successful were game shows, you said, soaps, and variety shows. So let's stick with the soaps and then do the game and the variety shows.
Okay.
With the soaps, okay, so you said Edge of Night. I knew was Another World. What
No,
other one?
another World was TV only.
Okay.
If you look at the
As
soap
the
opera,
as the guy
as the
like
world
as the world
turns, yeah,
turns. Okay.
that's an example. The success of soap operas on going from radio to television is a fairly obvious type of success. You already had the genre, you already had the sponsors, and you already had that 15-minute time period. You had the audiences who were ready to see it, and the format's pretty easy to translate. You don't have a lot of things that may be demanding on special effects, but you certainly have a risk in that you have some characters that can successfully make a transition over from radio to TV, and then you have some characters that don't. So it can kind of become a hit and miss. as to whether or not it's going to succeed. You have a show like One Man's Family, which was very successful on radio, but it isn't necessarily as successful on TV. You have The Guiding Light, started out on radio in 1937. It makes the transition to TV in 1952. Um, the radio version continues until 1956. So for 4 years there, it's on both TV and radio.
And like with Gunsmoke, was that the same fictional universe or not?
Well, as a matter of fact, with The Guiding Light, you've actually got same characters, same actors playing it on radio and TV. But gradually, what happens over the course is that they begin to recast roles as the success of the TV show expands. And then, of course, eventually in 56, it becomes TV only. And then in the early 60s, it expands from 15 minutes to a half an hour. And then all of the soaps eventually go to an hour in length, which means you've got a great culling of them. But that's one example of a very successful series. You have one called The Brighter Day, which people may not remember. But that was a rare example of a soap opera that made the transition from radio to TV that never expanded beyond 15 minutes. It was on radio from 48 to 56. It was on TV from 54 to 62. So again, you can see that there is an overlap in the times that it's on from on both radio and TV. The Brighter Day kind of changes a bit as it goes from radio to TV. It's actually a faith-based drama on radio. The Brighter Day, referring to the cross, the resurrection, and what faith can do to strengthen a family, to get you through various difficulties. It isn't quite so much that when you go to a TV, they de-emphasize the religious framings of the show. You've got a show that is called The First 100 Years, not to be confused with The Second 100 Years, which is the sitcom that I think Monty Markham stars in the late 60s on TV. First 100 Years was not that successful on radio. It was only on for a couple of years, and it's only on for a couple of years on TV. But I bring it up for a couple of reasons. One is because it originated in Chicago, not New York. And one, because it was on before The Guiding Light. So it changed its format. It was entirely recast, but it was an example of one of the early soap operas that made a transition. So The Edge of Night, Young Dr. Malone, The Secret Storm, Search for Tomorrow. Those were all examples of very successful radio soaps that made the transition and became even more successful soap operas on TV. What did they have to do? Well, to make them successful, a lot of these soap operas particularly depended on narrators to kind of transition you from scene to scene. You didn't do that on TV, so they had to kind of change that. They had to change the idea of having the inner monologue of the voiceover, and you had to deal with how you would change. You would have the time jumps. That 6 months later, 3 months later, a day later, you had to kind of change those. But the pacing is similar because they're already daily shows, they're already serials, so they were natural to come over to the daytime part of it. And of course, the sponsorship is natural because the sponsors who are appealing to the female audiences in daytime radio are the same ones that want to appeal to them on TV. So it was a good transition.
So, just to be clear, though, when you had the radio and TV versions of a soap opera, unlike Gunsmoke, where the scripts were written and then, going to be reused, you didn't have a situation where, let's say, one of the lead characters on Guiding Light had a miscarriage on the television, but was still pregnant 2 weeks later on the radio.
Yeah, as far as I know, you don't have storylines on radio and TV that are going to wildly um, the split apart. Now, having said that, I don't spend a lot of time listening to old time soap operas, just as I don't spend a lot of time watching them on TV. Although, if you asked me anything about Another World, because it was my mother's favorite soap opera, and so I was exposed to it like you're exposed to radiation when you're growing up, I could probably tell you something about the Frame family and Another World. But when it comes to the radio ones, I can't imagine you would do something as hideous as having characters diverge from what's happening between the two of them. I know that once this airs, I'm going to get an email from somebody who says, "You idiot, why didn't you know about this?" Well, I'll plead guilty. But in many cases, though, it should be said that you're looking at an overlap of maybe a couple of years. So you're looking at a series that frequently had a long run on radio, was on radio and TV both for a small period of time, and then goes on to a longer run on TV.
So, game shows, quiz shows, putting aside Groucho, um, was there any equivalent in radio to the quiz show scandals in television? Were they affected by the TV scandal?
I don't think so. Again, I could be wrong about that, but the quiz shows were playing for such relatively small stakes. Plus, quiz shows on the radio had always been satirized. Fred Allen made fun of them all the time. You had a show on radio called "It Pays to Be Ignorant," and so there were a lot of radio programs and movies satirized the ignorance of people who were on the radio, on a quiz show. But when you look at a show like the $64,000 Question, um, on radio it was called the $64 Question. And that was always a catchphrase, even if you weren't talking about the radio show. What you're talking about, people would say, there's the $64 question. Well, that's where that comes from. But of course, on TV, you're not going to give away $64. You got to give away $64,000. But you had panel shows, like the Quiz Kids, that made a transition to TV and did pretty well in making that transition, because you're looking at being able to add the visual personality of your characters who are appearing on TV. They may be the same people or similar people who are on radio, but now you're adding the visual appeal of their personality. So they make a pretty good transition. But a show like Truth or Consequences started out on radio. And you might wonder about that, because Truth or Consequences seems to be such a visual program. You think about the hilarious situations that people wind up getting into. But again, how much of a stretch does that get to be when you realize that Candid Camera started out on radio's Candid Microphone? So you can do that kind of stuff on radio. It's just different. But you had shows on radio like Information Please, 20 Questions. Those didn't come over to TV for long runs. Some of them tried, some of them didn't. But you had what they considered to be variations on those shows that came over. So you had What's My Line? If you can believe it, What's My Line did have a radio version. It didn't start on radio, but they did do for a little while a radio version of What's My Line that was a brand new show. It was not a simulcast of the TV version. And you might wonder how they were able to do that, especially when the panel isn't supposed to know what the person's occupation was. There is some thought that what happened was you might have had kind of a sotto voce announcer on the radio, because apparently there isn't any evidence of what the radio What's My Line actually sounded like. But you would have an announcer come on and say, the occupant's occupation is horse wrangler. And the radio listeners would be able to hear it, but supposedly the panel on TV couldn't. That didn't last very long. My point in bringing that up at all is that even when you had shows that did not translate directly from radio to TV, the influence of radio was evident, even though you don't have the direct lineage of a show like What's My Line. You do have shows that were similar enough to it that people were used to that kind of a panel show, and so it was easier for them to gain an audience on TV. You had a show like Name That Tune. Well, you have a show on the radio called Stop the Music that works essentially the same way. And so when Name That Tune begins on TV, even if it is a new show in the sense of its title, it's not a new show in the sense of its format. So you have that coming over. As I mentioned, you had, as we talked about early in the show, you had You Bet Your Life, you had the Quiz Kids, you have Truth or Consequences, where they're describing the stunts. You have Candid Microphone, becomes Candid Camera. So you do have cases where you have quiz shows that come over from radio to TV. But to get, I didn't really answer your question about the scandals, except to kind of say I didn't think a big deal. What I do want to say is there was always, when they were satirizing the quiz show on the radio, they always went from the presumption that some of the shows were rigged. But the shows were for such small potatoes, and they weren't as influential in the culture as the TV quiz shows became, that if there was anything about them, you weren't going to have anything nearing the kind of a scandal, because they just weren't important enough.
So, with variety shows, we think early television, we think of Godfrey and Sullivan, Uncle Milty, Sid Caesar on the comedy side, and then, the more prestigious, GE Theater or whatever, and shows like Patterns and, Rod Serling, Patty Chayefsky, that kind of thing. Were they also carried over from radio? Did we have, we did have radio plays. Was there a Chayefsky or a Serling back then?
There were authors who were better known for radio dramas than they might go on to become known for in TV. You did have a circle of very famous people who wrote for radio. I don't remember if Serling, when he was in Cincinnati, may have done some writing for radio, because almost everybody did, but he wasn't a famous radio writer. They did exist, though, and I guess you'd look at.
Well, Woody Allen he wrote for both. I think he wrote for radio before he wrote for Sid Caesar.
Yeah, he did. And you look at some of the famous radio writers of the time that are primarily known as having worked in radio, and you would probably have. Well, Selma Diamond, for example, got her start on radio before she became a pretty famous junk writer on TV. But you also had people who were better known for writing the dramatic scripts. And Orson Welles did a lot of writing for radio. Of course, Jack Webb with Dragnet. Jules Dassin did some work on radio before he transitioned over to the movies and TV. I am drawing a blank on probably two of the most famous radio writers, and I don't have them in my notes, and I'm going to try to look them up quickly to see if I can pull it up, because I am embarrassed that I'm drawing a blank on this.
It happens to the best of us.
But yes, the short answer is to answer your question, is yes, there was a royalty that existed in radio for famous writers, and I think that it is coming back to me. You had somebody like Uh, yeah, Serling did do some radio. Tad Mosel, who wrote for some radio things. Bob Kane did a lot of the Superman ones, of course, because he created Superman. So he became uh, pretty famous for that. Reginald Rose started out on radio.
Days of Wine
So
and Roses.
yeah, so you have a lot of you have the royalty, but there's a real difference in working for radio and working for TV, and I think that becomes apparent as the transitions go on.
Well, were there any other genres that we missed?
Well, we didn't talk a lot about the radio variety show, and one of the things I do want to mention, Bing Crosby was the host of the Kraft Music Hall for a long time on radio, and the reason that I bring up Crosby is because Crosby was always looking for a way to minimize his workload, and it was through the innovations on the Crosby Show that you wound up having pre-recorded radio programs where they had improved the quality of the radio sound to the point that it was indistinguishable from a live program. So beforehand, the problem always was that a radio transcription, that's what they called them, shows that were recorded for playback at a later time, just weren't of the quality. But once they reached that quality, then Crosby was able to lessen his own workload, and he was able to do maybe several shows at a time and then not have to come into the studio as often. That was one of the things that signaled the end of live radio, when you were able to, just as the case is with videotape and film on television, once you were able to record radio, you didn't have to do it live. So I think it's important to talk about Bing.
Uh, I wanted to just ask though, because the premise of this show was sort of the golden age transition
Yep.
between radio and TV. You said the 40s and 50s, but I do know, and seeing on the Wikipedia list, I do remember now the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in the late
Yes.
70s had a run on radio, as did I believe Doctor Who.
Doctor Who.
I believe the British, it lasted longer than here
Yes.
in the U.S.
Yeah, the BBC did do radio adaptations of Doctor Who. They've always had a more, I shouldn't say always, but the British radio, unlike American radio, became much more vital. It continues to this day to have much more of a life than network radio drama and comedy has in this country. And The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a great example of that. It is hilarious when you listen to it on the radio. And it is arguably funnier than it is on TV, because a character like Zaphod Beeblebrox, who's got two heads, just works better on radio than it does on TV. But they're shows that are very funny on their own. And you're right, Doctor Who is a show where they've been able to do radio adaptations. They still have a lot of drama on radio in England, radio anthologies. They still have a lot of cultural shows on radio. Here's one where I can talk about both of them. The Voice of Firestone was a radio show long before it came to TV, and it continued on radio and TV for quite some time before it became a TV-only show, and it became a very controversial TV show. If you can believe that a show about classic and popular music becomes controversial, it has to do with the radio, with the rating system. That's a great topic for another day. But The Voice of Firestone is another example of a variety show that had a long life on radio before it came to television. And I wanted to get that in because that is, as you pointed out, a form of entertainment that still exists over in the UK that we don't have on the networks here.
So, if you want to just wrap up,
I do, because the name finally came to mind. Arch Obler is who I was thinking about. One of the greatest writers for radio. He would have been the Chayefsky, the Serling of his day. You know, he did Lights Out. He did different kinds of radio dramas, experimental shows, really pushed the boundaries of what was possible on radio. And I could not remember him, and I would have been incredibly embarrassed if we had gone through the whole show without mentioning him. So now I feel a whole lot better than I did before. But to wrap things up, I think that there's no question that radio provided the early foundation for television. Many of the early shows that debuted on television started on radio. Without radio to build upon, television would have had a much more difficult time creating its own persona. Without the shows that you could transfer from radio to TV, you don't have many of the shows that TV starts out with. But as TV matures, you see the ability to develop TV shows on their own. TV starts to understand what works and what doesn't. They create their own form of entertainment. And at the same time, you're seeing fewer and fewer radio dramas or comedies or any kind of scripted show. You're seeing them fade out. So as the radio program decreases, the television program increases. As the amount of original programming on TV increases, shows that they are not adapting from radio, the amount of original programming on radio decreases. You have, in fact, only one real example of a show that ever went from TV to radio, and that is Have Gun Will Travel. The radio version of Have Gun Will Travel debuted after the TV series had been a success, and it was with a different cast. But that's the only notable example of a show that went from TV to radio. Everything was from radio to TV. So what does all of this mean? How would I sum it up? Without radio, TV suffers. Some of the most successful shows on TV came from radio. Once TV was able to develop its own means of entertainment, radio becomes less necessary. Once television becomes the dominant entertainment form, radio becomes less necessary. Radio goes to the point where now they're talking about the very survival of radio. You don't even have network radio news. And that's a tragedy. But television is going through its own problems now. You've gone from broadcast television to cable to streaming, and now you wonder cord cutting. You wonder about the survival of local television. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. What goes around comes around. Ultimately, fans of old-time radio, and I consider myself a mild fan of that, they will say that there are advantages that radio offers that television can never match. That is true. There are also advantages television offers that radio can never match. That is true. Ultimately, what you wind up with are two distinct forms of entertainment. There is certainly room for both of them, and there's certainly room to enjoy both of them. And for anybody who has not listened to old-time radio, looking at it from this point of view as to how radio forms the basis for scripted dramatic shows on TV, I think it's well worth looking into. And from there, you're going to start to find shows about radio that never made the transition that you're going to love.
When you were just talking about less necessary, apropos of radio shows, I was thinking, I misheard you first. Instead of saying less necessary, I thought you said Les Nessman. And
I knew you were going to go that way.
But anyway, so we'll be back next month to end out the year, and we'll see what we have. But thanks a lot.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Dan.